feel in my family anyways. I talk and everybody is, oh, I can't hear you. So I've stopped talking as much.
Okay.
How are you doing? Feel free to unmute.
Okay. Okay, recording is back on.
And we have Simcha back for the first time in a while. That's good. Hello.
Baruch haba.
So, I don't know. Let's sing a song first.
Okay. I da 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 I da 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 I da 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 I da 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 I da I da
Okay. 1 second. I'll be right back.
We'll be right back.
Jake, do we need to check in with anything before I get going fully here? Back. So where are we? Were we ending chapter 6? Is that what we're coming to now? Or we started chapter 7 already? Someone refresh my memory.
I think we started chapter 7.
Because we did the part about, oh yeah, I think, right. That makes sense to me. Because we did the part about, the Torah last week. We focused on that. Yeah, and we skipped the last section, largely because it's fairly similar to what's in Rabbinic Midrash.
You mean of chapter 6?
But how far did we get into chapter 7?
I think we just started it,
Yeah, okay.
but I'm not 100% sure,
Okay.
since it seems like months ago.
So, yeah, but it wasn't, strangely. It was only 1 week ago, right? But we had Shavuot in between? Is that what happened?
And a bunch of other stuff.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, and also the country sort of went crazy and haywire. There's that. It's quite a time.
Yes, last night was particularly bad, demoralizing, I think.
What happened last night? Did I miss something?
Trump had military police attack a peaceful protest in Lafayette Park in order for him to walk through across the street to St. John's Church, where he could do a photo op with the Bible, and then said that he wants to, basically to have the military occupy all the states.
But he doesn't have the authority to do that, so I don't think that will happen.
Well, there's a lot of things that he doesn't have the authority to do that apparently he's gotten away with doing. That
he's got what?
Gotten away with doing.
Well, yeah, he doesn't have the authority to be a rapist or a criminal either. So there's that. The good thing that came out of that was him being denounced by the bishop of the Episcopalians.
Yeah, but he basically has the authority to do whatever nobody stops him from doing.
Right.
So we'll see if the military stops him. It looks like they're not inclined to follow his orders, but we don't know. Yeah,
we don't know. I'm not sure whether what we're studying gives us any guidance in these kinds of matters. It's something that's been on my mind. What do we learn from, sort of, it's not just esoteric, but things about truth that are sort of the kind of truth you deal with in calm circumstances. where you're trying to figure out, oh, what's best and what's right about the world? How does the world work? That kind of thing, which is different than when you're in the middle of a confrontation and deciding, well, do I want to stay here where there's going to be tear gas or not? It's not the same kind of truth.
But the sages studied under occupation, and they studied during rebellions,
They did.
and
They did.
studied during
And I
pandemic.
don't know that those were moments of great theology.
I don't know.
But maybe they were.
So if Reb David, if what we're studying did have something to teach us for now, what would it be?
I'll tell you that the part that I'm looking at in the book and in general is definitely bigger picture,
Mhm.
not tactics, not strategies.
Mhm.
And part of the bigger picture is always understanding that there are multiple sides to a reality
Mhm.
and multiple sides to truth.
Mhm.
And there's no such thing as one side being entirely
Mhm.
true and the other and another side being entirely false.
Mhm.
I mean, we come so close to getting to that state in the current political reality that it
Mhm.
boggles my mind a little bit. But if one can look at politics as an ecosystem and try to understand how the parts are balancing out with each other and how every part is dependent on every other part, I think that there's an element of understanding the complexity
Mhm.
and affirming that the complexity holds a truth that no one perspective will hold,
Mhm.
that can keep us from becoming too blind or one-sided in how we see the reality or the situation. But in a way that's good. It's like keeping your head above water as you're in the middle of a flood. But doesn't really tell you which way to swim.
Right.
See, does that make sense?
Very much.
Yeah. So that's the part where the work I do doesn't feel like it's very useful sometimes. When I try to put it in juxtaposition to that kind of.
Well, it is useful because it's like it comes down on the side of life, and also the act of us doing this together is very life supporting, you know.
Mm-hmm. I hope that's true.
And
Yeah.
also
It's
keeping our
true for
heads
me.
above water, keeping our heads
Yeah.
above water is a very important part of the story.
Mm-hmm.
I'll learn where to swim in other conversations.
Yeah.
But I'm very much here for this one.
Yes, absolutely. So, well, this whole chapter is about all the different ways that you can extend the image of God into the world around us. And so it's very much about breaking down walls that we have, intellectual walls and spiritual walls towards seeing bigger realities. And it's about looking at the tricks and playfulness of the Kabbalists in doing that, and then maybe thinking about what do we take from that for ourselves. I thought it might be good to focus on this one idea at the beginning of the chapter, which we haven't talked about yet. The quote from Sarah, not the quote, the idea from Sarah Edith Schneider, also known as Susan Schneider. You might have heard of her if you're familiar with sort of very orthodox kind of Torah coming out of the old city, which is where she is. Does anyone know her
She
name?
writes about the Rebbe, right?
I think
She
so.
does,
She also
yeah,
has something she does. Sorry, she has something she puts out every year called Purim Bursts, which is usually a pretty good vort on some insight about Torah. I didn't read it this year, but I usually do. Her book, which is quoted there, or cited there, Kabbalistic Writings on the Nature of Masculine and Feminine. It brings up a very important general issue, which we have touched on already, but I want to touch on it a little bit more right now, which is the question of how do you take a tradition which is clearly not just very man-centered and not feminist, but very phallocentric, very explicitly and specifically phallocentric, and find truth in that. And what Sarah Schneider does, she goes through several Kabbalistic readings of the Midrash about the moon and the sun. Right? I think you probably are familiar with the Midrash, but I'll just say it briefly to make sure we're all on. Hi, Nayana. We're all on the same page, which is that God. It says God made two great lights, and then in the next verse it said God made the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. So the Midrash asks, how can they be two great lights if one is greater and one is lesser? And the Midrash responds with a story that is, God went to make the two great lights, and then the moon said to God, to the Holy One, "Hey, Nana, I think you need to turn off your mic."
Yeah, sorry.
It's okay. Said to the Holy One, "How can two rulers share one crown?" And God says, "You're right. Go make yourself small." And then the moon is inconsolable and says, "You know, is it right that the one who asks should be demoted, should be punished?" And God says, "Go and let's see if I get the order. I'm going to get the order wrong, but go and people will use you at night." And he says, and the moon says, what does the moon say? Does anyone remember what the moon says to that? God says, go and people will use you at night. Go and people will even use you in the day. And the moon says, well, who cares about being a candle in the sunlight?
I'm gonna
There's a
put,
third.
oh, sorry. I
What's
did a
that?
web page about this and I'm gonna put it in the chat that people can look at it later. Okay.
Super duper. Okay. Anyway, he tries to get the moon to sort of accept this demotion, and the moon is inconsolable. And so the Midrash ends by saying, God says, sacrifice for me a new moon offering, from which we understand, from which the Midrash understands, God is saying, sacrifice a sin offering for me. It's a sin offering, specifically a chatat. Sacrifice a sin offering for me because I sinned against the moon by making it become small, just because it asked the question. Oh, God says rule at night, and moon says, but I'm only going to rule for half the time, because half the time, I'm going to be waning and waxing. So what's the point? That was the one, and I don't remember what the third one is. But at any rate, this becomes the paradigm in Kabbalah for the diminishment of the feminine in relation to the masculine. And this has mythic dimensions. And for most of Kabbalah, as Elliot Wilson, this is the part we've talked about already, as Elliot Wilson points out, for most of Kabbalah, the goal is to reintegrate the feminine into the masculine. So essentially it makes the feminine disappear into the masculine. But what Sarah Schneider has done is taken several readings of this particular midrash and shown that for those texts and those people, the goal of redemption is that the feminine and the masculine should become equal to each other again. They should be equally great. And that it was a sin of the structure of creation itself that the feminine should be in any way less than the masculine. So thus far. So she goes through all these texts, and she's quite well aware that that's not the majority view of Kabbalah. That a lot of Kabbalah is about the feminine being absorbed into the masculine, not about the feminine becoming equal to the masculine. So in both modes, in both ways of seeing the myth, it's a cosmic tragedy that the feminine is less than the masculine in some way. It's assumed in both paradigms that that is part of the structure of creation that needs to be fixed, and that we're here to fix it. But the way of fixing, in one case, has feminist potential, and the other case has quite the opposite. So what she says is that you can take the texts that lean in what we would think of as a feminist direction and build what she calls a partsuf out of them, a whole reality out of them. In other words, it doesn't matter that the majority of the texts say one thing. It doesn't matter whether it's a majority or a minority. It just doesn't matter. What matters is that we have this thread of text that we can string together and build a reality out of just this strata of the text, just this lineage of the text, and say, this is what we're following. That makes sense. So for me, that's very much a good paradigm for what I'm doing with the ecological texts. That is, yeah, most texts in rabbinic Judaism are negatively anthropocentric. For sure, the majority. But the exceptional texts stand out because they're exceptional, and that makes them important, and that makes them sufficient to build a different reality out of. Yeah. That makes sense to people? Looks like we lost Nayana again. Hopefully she'll find her way back.
I wanted to just say I was going to share this page about the moon,
Mhm.
and my website was recently professionally redesigned, and now the link is not working. It's going to the wrong
Oh.
page. It's still out there somewhere, but yeah, it's had a lot of problems since it was beautifully redone. It needs to be fixed.
I'm sorry about that. You could search for a text that's in the
Yeah, see
page.
this on the
and you'll find it.
moon, and I did a whole page on Wellsprings of Wisdom about that legend of the moon and the artwork and just a lot of nice things, videos and stuff. So when I get it, I can get back to it. I can share, Polina.
Why don't you send it out to the email list when you have it, okay, Julie? Good, okay. This is important because, you know, this chapter goes through all the different ways. Okay, so the Tikkun Zohar says that the bird's body is the image of Yod He Vav He. Okay, and a tree is the image of God because it gives without needing to receive back, at least not in an evolutionary sense, but in the sense of, in the immediate sense, because it gives us fruit, and we don't have to give something back to it to get the fruit. So therefore, it's an image of God representing how God acts in the world. For example, so those are just two examples. So we can build up a catalog of things or dimensions that the Kabbalists or some Kabbalists thought are in the image of God. So then we have a list. A list is not a theology. So how do you make it into theology, or on what basis can you justify saying that this can become a theology? You see the problem, I think, right? And the answer for me comes from what Sarah Schneider proposes, which is that exceptional texts stand out and call on us to make them into something bigger. So the idea of Partsuf is, it actually comes from Greek, prosipon, so I've heard. Although it always seemed to me that it looked more like a Persian word. For sure, it does not look like a Hebrew word, but it means face. And the original, rather original is not the right term, the early Midrashim about the creation of Adam v'Chava, Adam and Eve, describe the first human as being du partsufim, or du partsuf, two-faced. And then what that means is that there was a male half and a female half. And therefore each half, because each one was a full person, also had a face. You know, you could have a half where half is an arm and a leg and the other half is a head and a trunk, right? So that would be not two persons, but two halves, one of which is a person and one of which is not. But it's very specific that it's two faces, not just two bodies together. And then one of the sort of mythical plays that goes on within Kabbalah is, does this mean that the faces facing each other, facing away from each other, facing in the same direction? How is this two-faced creature imagined literally in the kind of geometric way? How does it exist? But that word partsuf becomes used in later Kabbalah as a very essential kind of technical term. So the way it's used is most pronounced in Lurianic Kabbalah. And the way it works there is that we start with the myth that the original creation shattered into pieces, and these pieces had to be built back up into a new creation. So the initial creation, this is going to be simplification, but it's good enough, I think, is that each sphera gets emanated in a line, in a chain, down to Malchut. And the problem with this is that each sphera receives the entire energy of creation from the sphera above it all at once. And that breaks it. So all the lower six break, the lower six sphera, they break and they shatter and they fall onto Malchut and crush Malchut. And that's why the feminine is less than the masculine in this broken reality. Yeah. So that's the first idea. The second idea is that God takes the pieces and rebuilds them into persons, different than Sphirot, a little bit more fuller image of what each of these is, which are called Partsufim. And the Partsufim are Nukva. Actually, we can just look on, I would say we can just look at the chart in the book, except I made a minor mistake on the chart. So it kind of, it kind of bugs me to look at it, but I think it's worth looking at. So why don't I just open it up instead of complaining about it? Give me a sec. I gotta find the Acrobat reader, okay.
What page is this?
It's oh yeah, you can just look at the page. It's towards the end. It's the appendix on the history of Kabbalah, which is
361?
page
361.
361.
Yeah.
Okay, well, you can see the chart right there. I'll call it up in a second so people can look at it on screen if you want to. So you have this Sphirot, but you also have the Partsufim, where it says Nukva above the Hay in Malchut. That's the Partsuf, which means the feminine. And then above Tiferet, it says Ze'er Anpin, which means the little face. And that includes those six together, Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferet, Netzachot, Yesod. Then in Bina, above the Hay, it says Ima, mother. And in Chochmah, it says father, Abba. And then Keter is divided into two, Atik Yamin and Arich Anpin. Arich Anpin means the long face, and Atika means usually translated as Ancient of Days. I'm not really sure what the best translation is for that.
What's the tiny mistake?
Oh, the tiny mistake is that in the legend of the map, it says that there are 5 Partsufim, but there are 6. That's all. It's not that bad a mistake. It's just confusing. You probably wouldn't even notice if I didn't point it out as the truth. At any rate. So that's the picture. How do I, oh, like that. That's the picture. And what happens, what this idea means is that the pieces are built up into something different, which has a stability and a reality that it didn't have before. And so that's the idea of Partsuf. So that's what Starra Schneider is using as a kind of framework. You take the broken pieces and you build them up into something that's stronger and bigger and more significant than it was before it was broken. Now in Lurianic Kabbalah, this has particularly complex ways of being expressed, which I don't really go into in the book and don't plan to go into right now. But what you might notice is that for Lurianic Kabbalah and the Partsufim, the lower 7 are turned into just 2 Sphirot, and the top 3 are turned into 4 Sphirot. So what happens is that the sort of the most esoteric gets more complicated, and the less esoteric gets less complicated. And that's sort of the way of Lurianic Kabbalah, to make everything more complicated at the most esoteric level and put less attention to what's left over after that. Hi, Ellen. Hi, good to have you. So that's the idea of Partsuf, and that's what I'm trying to do in chapter 7, is to kind of collect these ideas that we can build into Partsufim, but it's not the framework of what the Partsuf should be. It's the pieces that need to be built into something bigger, right? So there's 2 questions at stake here. What are the characteristics? What are the pieces? Obviously is the fundamental, like fruit trees are a thing that's in God's image. The body of the bird is a thing that's in God's image, right? Because Yud is the head and the 2 Hays are the 2 wings and Vav is the body. Exactly. The spectrum of colors is an image of God because it includes all the Sphirot, representation of all the Sphirot in it. these kinds of things. So we can take a list of all these things and then ask the question, what characteristics do some of these things have in common, so that we can get a kind of general explanation of what makes something in God's image. And the qualities that make something in God's image are basically three. One has to do with the lower mirroring the higher. Another has to do with uniting the higher and the lower together. And higher and lower, I'm just using them in that Kabbalistic sense of higher worlds and lower worlds, more esoteric, more invisible, as it were. And anything that represents the wholeness of creation, or the wholeness of a part of creation, specifically, like wholeness, is also representative of God's image. So the whole creation itself is the image of God, quite obviously and simply, because it fits on all those levels. A fruit tree unites heaven and earth. Human body unites heaven and earth. That's part of our vertical stature, as the Kabbalah understood it. So
David, could you say the three things again?
Oh yeah, when the lower mirrors the higher, when something unites the higher and the lower, and when something includes the full spectrum of reality in some dimension. So it's this kind of mirroring, this kind of connecting, and this kind of representation of wholeness. So all the animals together. Well, here's a question. So one of the parts of this chapter is about the animals of Ezekiel's chariot. So it's understood that the animals of Ezekiel's chariot form Yud He Vav He, four things. Anytime something's been fours, it means it's Yud He Vav He. That means it's God's image. So we have Yud He Vav He, and this implies the spectrum of all the animals in a rather inadequate way, because the four animals are, of course, human, ox, lion, and eagle. So there are a few categories of animals left out there, or unimagined. Plus human, it's good that human is in the middle of all that. It implies that we're part of the animal world. It implies an acceptance of being part of the animal world. So that's very positive. But does that mean that the animal world, if humans were absent, wouldn't be in God's image? Because that is one of the implications. So let's look at one particular text here. I'm looking for it in the book, like in the physical book, and then I'll turn to it in the regular book in a second. Where am I going to find it? Animals Above and Below, page 223. Now, there's a particular text I want to go to. This one here. So we'll start where it says, we also saw in Shnei Luchot Habrit. Oh, I didn't share my screen. Sorry, I need to do that. Here comes my screen. I totally forgot about that. There we go. You all got it? So I'm starting up here. We saw in Shnei Luchot Habrit that the four animals together represent the dimensions of the Sfirot. So this is the quote: Chesed is water, Gevurot is fire, Tiferet is air, and Malchut is earth. So the four elements correspond to these four Sfirot, which represents a picture of reality, which is the image of God. Not entirely complete, mind you. It doesn't include Keter Chachma Bina, but it includes enough of the Sfirot to say that this is an image of God. We call what is later manifested from Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferet, and Malchut metaphorically fire, water, air, and earth in the secret of the four animals. So the secret of the four animals, anytime it says secret of, it's referring to, again, this is my opinion. Not everyone who studies Kabbalah will agree with this. Anytime it says the secret of, more often than not, it's referring to the image of God. Secret of means image of God. It's the image of God that's represented by the four animals. But in what fashion? Which of them is Yud? Which is Hey, which is Vav, and which is the latter Hey? It's complicated. In the Zohar, we have this text, which I find meaningful. These two texts we're going to look at on this page. The human gazes at them all, ox, eagle, and lion, while all of them ascend and gaze at him. Then they all are traced in their engravings in the mystery of one name called Awesome, Nora. So it is written of them, the likeness of their faces was a human face. All of them include this image, and this image includes them. So this image is the human being, which is necessarily the image of God, as we know. All their likenesses together, right, include the image of the human, and the human includes all of them. We've heard this motif before, and we'll hear it again. This idea that somehow the human is being in the image of God means that the human includes the image of the other creatures in itself. The mystery of one name, again, referring to image of God. Nora, referring to image of God. It's all like a hall of mirrors is not quite the right term. It's like a bunch of mirrors reflecting each other from different angles. So they all end up meaning the same thing, but in ways that teach you different dimensions of the same thing. So far, okay with that text? And that text revolves to a large degree on the fact that the word demut is used for the animal faces. And demut, of course, is the word used about God's image in Genesis 1. So it's those two things together that make this idea. Now we're going to go to the next text. There's one in the middle from the Zohar that says a similar thing. We don't need to read that one. Zeh Sefer Toldot Adam. This is the book of the generations of Adam. Zeh, Zayin Hey, Vadai, really, literally, means the 12 constellations of the Adam that is above, Adam de La'ela. So 12, Zayin Hey obviously makes 12 because you add 7 and 5 together. Simple.
The 12 being the signs of the zodiac.
And yes, and 12 means the sign of the zodiac, which means, of course, that the heavens themselves are an image of God because they are the upper human being. The 7 together, which are part of Adam De'ela, which is a technical term, about which it says, concerning them, tribes of Yah, testimonies of Yisrael. So the 12 constellations are like the 12 tribes of Israel, which makes the 12 tribes of Israel in the image of God in this particular text because they mirror the image of God, that is the constellations. So we have the inclusion of all, representing God's image, which is all the constellations, the mirroring, which is the way that the humans and the constellations, specifically Israel, the 12 tribes and the 12 constellations, reflect each other. Obviously, we mean the 12 signs of the zodiac, not all the rest of the constellations. Thank you, Simcha. We have a diagram. Zeh literally are, now where does this come from? The 4 faces of the lion, the 4 faces of the ox, 4 faces of the eagle, that in them are recognized the faces of human beings. And all their faces are impressed in the 4 letters of Yud He Vav He. So we have another level of mirroring. And in this case, the human is the image of God because the human represents the spectrum of the animals, which includes the 4 faces of the lion and the ox and the eagle all together, which makes 12, which makes Adam La'ela. So Adam de La'ela is comprises or comprises the 12 faces of the animals themselves, which represent in a schematic way the spectrum of all animal life on Earth, in a way that's, obviously from a biological perspective highly inadequate, but it's the way it happened in Jewish mythos. So that's the one we use. That's the pattern we use. All these faces are impressed in the 4 letters of Yud He Vav He. So the 4-ness of the number 12 itself is a symbol of Yud He Vav He. It's a symbol in the heavens. It's a symbol in the animals. Because the lower animals are mirror images of the upper animals. The upper animals are the animals of Ezekiel's chariot, which are representing in some symbolic way the physical animals that are on Earth. So then that's again another kind of mirroring, which enables the image of God to be expressed. And the spectrum is representing the wholeness as God's image. Did this make enough sense to everyone? Julie's not sure. Talk. Say something. No, she says no. Anyone who's feeling slightly confused, say what's on your mind.
How did we get to 4 animals, the 4 faces?
The 4 faces of the lion?
Yeah, I'm just not sure how it got to 4.
Because right. That's kind of basic. Let's see if I can remember, because I haven't looked at,
I know the chariot goes all around. But
yes, but how many chariots are there?
I don't know. I thought there was 1.
I thought there was 1 too. I better look this up
And
before I start saying something that I don't know anything
face
about.
is on all 4.
What's that?
Each of the faces is on all 4. So each of them, 4 lions, 4 eagles, because each there are 4 wheels.
Oh yeah, because it says it. Because it says it right in the
Verse
text.
6.
That's why.
Va'arba panim la'achat,
Thank
va'arba
you.
knafaim la'achat la'hem.
Translation, please.
There are 4 faces for each one and 4 wings for each one.
Yeah, because it says it. That's all.
It also says there's 4 sides of the world.
Say that again.
It also says the image of the human includes all of them, and they face to the 4 sides of the world.
Yes.
The 4 cardinal directions.
It's not actually a bad reading of the text. Usually a Kabbalistic reading is one which is often highly forced, seemingly out of range of what the normal meaning of the text could be. But this text is so outside the normal anyway, without anything added to it, that it kind of just fits straight into Kabbalah.
Well, it's
Also, 4 in lots of Aboriginal cultures signifies wholeness or completeness.
Mm-hmm. Right. And often that has to do with 4 directions. And in some cases has to do with 4 elements, which seem to be a motif that's quite common through different cultures.